You are listening to the Cultural Providers Network podcast, a Minnesota Association for Children's Mental Health production, building and sustaining a network of culturally and ethnically diverse voices to promote policies, practices, standards, and research that improve the mental health of children, their families, and communities.
This podcast is brought to you by the Minnesota Department of Health. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Cultural Providers Network podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Jones. I am the Executive Director of Minnesota Association for Children's Mental Health. And on today's podcast, we have Jodi, who is a clinician in the area, who's going to talk to us about a BIPOC's perspective within the field. Jodi, do you mind sharing who you are, where you come from, and all those good things, where you work, all those good things about you?
Yeah. So my name is Jodi Holzemer. I am a Korean adoptee, mostly raised here in Minnesota. Consider myself a Minnesota native. I currently work at North Star Behavioral Health, one of our men's locations. I'm the clinical supervisor over there. I've also have about 25 years experience working with special education, specifically emotional behavioral disorders, children with autism. And then I would say in about the last 4 or 5 years, I've been focusing in the addiction field, specifically being very trauma responsive in the addiction field.
Awesome. Thank you. We're looking forward to hearing that perspective. Chemical dependency, mental health, they kind of go hand in hand, unfortunately. And it's been a growing field of co-occurring disorders. And I think sometimes the addiction services and things kind of get overlooked for the mental health, especially in today's world where we talk a lot about mental health crisis, whether it's through young people or adults. And a lot of times people what we don't talk about is how, chemical dependency follows right there with that and how a lot of people are using substances to even address mental health issues. So we're definitely looking forward to hearing your perspective on that on today's podcast. But before we dive in that in there, can you share with me what inspired you to seek therapy as a profession initially? Like, how did you get into this work?
I think personally, it started just the minute I was pregnant with my first child. I knew that there were things within my family and myself that if I wanted to be the best parent for a human, that I wanted to make sure that I was healing myself, and not carrying on any of those generational things. And the more as I've grown as a person, I just truly believe that creating safe spaces for people to kind of just be is important to me. I found that it's really cool to just find ways to get paid to just be yourself and to do things that you believe in. And I really believe in just being able to be connected with other people and providing safe spaces.
Absolutely. What are some things that people, when they come to therapy, from your experience, has anyone said, "Hey, I'm looking for a cultural provider, or I want somebody of color or a similar background to me"? Have you heard these types of things? And if you have, what are some things that people typically ask?
Um, it's the things that I hear kind of in my field and working with people that are in recovery, primarily in the residential. I'm in a long-term residential program. And before that, I was also in withdrawal management. And so we're getting people very raw, very fresh, coming out of their addiction, just starting to really consider, hey, something in my life isn't okay. So it's actually a little bit more subtle than that. It's, Jodi, I'm not really liking this mental health. I don't really connect with them. I'm kind of looking for something different, or just being able to be in a space that is that was more white dominated to just say, hey, it's okay. Like, yeah, I know it's kind of tough out there, and the sigh of relief that I would see on my clients' faces of, oh, you get it, or just a one statement of, yeah, man, being a person of color, I get it. And just it was almost sometimes having to create that safe space of acknowledgement for somebody to acknowledge, I'm not really feeling this, or I might need something different. A lot of times I feel like people weren't even safe enough to say it themselves.
Wow. Yeah, I think that definitely is an experience that I've seen as well. I forgot to mention to you that I spent Almost 7.5 years as a clinician before I transitioned out of doing clinical work and doing more systematic or structure work in the mental health field. And my experience was pretty similar. A lot of people would, they would have a level of relief that somebody actually understood what they were, saying, or had a little bit of background of what they've gone through. Now, that doesn't mean that clinicians just get an easy break with clients because of that, but it does bring a little bit of relief that they can kind of culturally identify and connect to the therapist. Which I want to ask a follow-up question too, because when we're trained, whether it's in becoming a LADC or LPC, LPCC, marriage and family therapist, or even a licensed clinical social worker, a lot of our schools of discipline focus on not self-disclosing, not and creating this divide, really, this protector that you don't connect with your clients on that level. And I remember being in school thinking, well, this is going to be very difficult for the clients that I was aiming to work with, which was African American folks, because I know the community I come from, and we want to know like who you are, where you come from, what you like to eat, which like we want to know a little bit about you, and that helps with our level of vulnerability to open up. And the mental health field was, creating this thing where it was like, no, you're not supposed to do that. And I was like, oh
Right.
boy, this is gonna be difficult. So has that been your experience where you've kind of had to go against some of your academic learning or some of your credentialing to connect with clients?
Absolutely. And it's funny because we talked just today in group this morning. It's what I call the whole of understanding, I don't have to know the whole as a whole is round. There's an infinite amount of paths there. And so while I don't have to walk your exact journey, and I said to a client, I don't need to know what it's like to be a 60-year-old Black man that grew up in Chicago and have done and experienced your life experiences. What I do know is when I've also felt hopeless, when I've also felt abandoned, rage, or that I have been experienced an injustice so large that I don't think my life is worth it. I can recognize that. And what I can share with you is my experiences of how I came to that place, right? But we're not connecting over the actual events, we're connecting over the emotional experiences of it. And I myself probably tend to self disclose more than I think most clinicians. Just in nature, it's kind of showing how well, this is what I know, this is what I went through. And I think that it helps because, again, the rule that I use is I don't self disclose anything that I'm not um, comfortable with, that I haven't worked through, that I haven't been able to provide meaning and value to my own life. And so and then doing that from this experience, I've had this emotional experience, and then I came to these conclusions. And this is how I was able to use that for my healing. And so when people can kind of see that, and then the recognition, I work with men. And so there is a lot of divide, but helping them understand what would a woman's perspective be? What would a woman of color's perspective be? What would an LGBTQ woman color perspective be? And then, hey, what would that mean for me? When have I also felt different? Maybe not because I was BIPOC, but maybe because I was a different marginalized thing, or maybe just because I'm in addiction.
Wow, absolutely. So that level of intersectionality just kind of comes in, and you have to work with it as best as possible. Because you do get, especially with group work, as you were talking about, you have a variety of identities, cultural backgrounds, and experiences in that group, but they're all collectively there for their healing journey. So how do you kind of mirror and match and kind of create these threads between them to help them see how they can keep pushing through? That's amazing. Have you found yourself tailoring your approach therapeutically for clients at any time? And if so, what does that look like for you?
So, yes and no. I mean, I think that I love working in the substance use field because very clearly, like you can take a picture of a brain and say, well, this is where your brain is a little bit different because you've used these substances. And then this is what that part of the brain means. And so I love substance use because we can say, because of these changes, this is how your brain operates. And the changes that were made in your brain actually impacts your emotional experience and your ability to process that, which 100% impacts your behaviors. And oftentimes, most times in this society, we do determine our worth, our value, our identity by our behaviors first. So I love the field because I feel it's between the medical and the behavioral sciences, and I can pull it all together. The part that I really kind of emphasize in kind of my style is understanding what trauma is and really being able to say that it is unique to everybody. It's when my emotional experience, my physical experience, or my mental experience, and my boundary of safety is crossed, physical, mental, emotional, I personally believe that I cannot cope with it. So first, the situation has to be incredibly awful, physically, mentally, or emotionally. And then the second component is I believe I cannot cope. And when that happens, I can show them in your brain, this is what happens. And it's fight, flight, or freeze. It's impulse, it's instinct. And for them, it's use. And so when we can kind of construct that, and that's what I'll use my own experiences of, this is where emotionally I felt unsafe today. Emotionally, 15 years ago might have been different. Physically might be different. So it's constantly changing, and we can't identify that for anybody else. When I can identify how that is in me, though, now I can relate in somebody else. And so then being able to, again, tailor things to each individual, but bring it back to that common base of, this is what's going on for me that's like you, but different, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's a huge part of this whole journey, is being able to make that connection for people to help them kind of unlock what they need
Yes.
to keep moving forward. Absolutely, absolutely. That actually brings another question to mind: is what role do you believe addressing systematic issues such as racism, discrimination, intergenerational trauma, um, how much does that play a role in supporting BIPOC clients and communities therapeutically?
That's a really big question.
Yeah. You can
And
take
as
some time to
somebody,
digest it.
yeah, I think if you can't, we can understand our individual experiences, um, but understanding how the system works and where systemic racism has existed, understanding. I may have a relative who is a police officer and love them dearly, but understanding that the entire police force is based in slavery, understanding just kind of that the collective approach to our lives, right? How they've impacted us individually. And so being able to say, even just to a client, and like with the referral process of, this is this program and this is where they're wonderful. These are some things that we may or may not come up against. Where do you feel comfortable with that? Helping people kind of understand to, I guess the word that comes to my mind the most is white spaces. Here's an amazing program, but it does have a white space feel to it. Are you interested in being with people of your culture? Are you interested in being in a space that is really dedicated to understanding, the Somali population? Or culturally, I don't know what impacts you the most. Are you more comfortable in spaces that aren't specific to your culture because of different shames or knowing different people? I think I just think just being aware of just the different spaces that I can put my clients in on that aspect. It's something that I fight against personally. I think it's something I'm still working through and struggling of being able to, is I want to have the best spaces. I want to have the best communities, the best teams, gently pointing out even to my colleagues, hey man, we've got some unchecked bias going on. Hey man, I see that we're uh, really passionate about our own mission, our own drives, but let's really acknowledge that we can't help but treat people that look like us sometimes a little bit better. Well, not that
Yeah.
we're treating anybody bad, but
Right.
look where we're playing the favoritism, right? And just kind of
Right.
knowing it inside of ourselves. And then what does that look like for our policies?
Right.
Where are we enforcing our policies? What decisions are we making and why?
Mm, absolutely. Yeah, you actually bring up a really good point. Another thing that I've even experienced myself is like sometimes there's this like thin line of our work as BIPOC providers where it is part personal and part professional for us. And I think a lot of times, whether it's through the educational institutions we go through or even the workplaces that we find ourselves in, that doesn't always get highlighted and doesn't get supported. That even though we talk about transference and counter transference and things, those are true, but we're still human. We still come from communities. And sometimes we understand that pain, or we have that pain that our clients are going through right
Yeah.
now. And we have to do some additional work as clinicians to even like protect our own selves, because it can get very real very quickly. and and let's be honest, I think that since we're here in the state of Minnesota, when George Floyd was murdered, I think that that's why a lot of clinicians, we felt it, like especially the BIPOC clinicians. I had a lot of conversations. I actually had kind of a small BIPOC like support Zoom group going on for a little while, because people were like, "Man, everyone's coming to us for therapy, but we need to talk ourselves. Like we're not
Yeah.
good." Like, and that was I mean, that was real for a lot of people. And I think that that's something that, as we continue to support one another in this field, that we should be very transparent about, is like, there's this thin line between provider and between our own personal selves that we do have to work on. So any thoughts on that?
100%. And I think that one thing too is having support with other BIPOC providers is so important, because I have friends of all different race, gender, ethnicities, and while I can have allies in it, it's exhausting, and being able to like gently say it's frustrating. There's a I had a professor that refused to speak about what white culture was until all white people could really understand what it was to be a person of color. And it just hit me real not right. I said, but how can we know what we're up against if we don't understand what it is? How can you only talk about one without the other? And then the being able to be in a space where I can talk about, well, this is what white culture is. And this is why, my friend, you are experiencing, just notice. And when I tell my clients, just pay attention. Where are you having a little dissonance inside of yourself? Where are you getting frustrated? And having spaces to even talk about with some of my people of color, like, there's a whole trauma going on with some white people, is recognizing where they didn't mean to be supportive of the system and they have. And I am too
Mhm.
exhausted to hold space for their trauma. I acknowledge it, and I love that they're here, and I love that they're starting to wake up. But there is a whole trauma response. I am exhausted. I'm exhausted from talking about it. I'm exhausted from holding space for myself as much as for them, or as much as even saying, even with other people of color being told, Jodi, you're an Asian woman. You can't identify what it is to be a Black woman, because your pain isn't, you have the easy
Mm,
stereotypes. And then it's like, so just recognizing that everybody has their privilege, everybody has their own experiences, regardless of our colors, and understanding where all of it lies is, it starts at that personal level, and seeing it systemically is, but it starts at the personal level too.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It is difficult, especially when we are in BIPOC spaces. Sometimes there's this, I think the term's called oppression Olympics, is the term that I heard one time. It's like we start competing with whose trauma is worse than the other, and that's exhausting for me, because I don't think that that's helpful for any of us, because now we're just like we're kind of trauma bonding with each other about how awful things can be, and that doesn't help us move forward. And I think that for me, it's always been helpful. For my mindset is like, okay, you've had an experience that has been harmful, and I just kind of
Mhm.
start there, and I work based on how harmful is that experience, and what can I do to make sure I don't cause any further harm. And that's with anybody, but so I try to keep that in mind, and just assume that that every space is not comfortable, but I should try to do something not to make it more uncomfortable. And
Yeah.
that has worked for me a little bit, but also I have work to do too. And I think that that's important. You brought up a really good point about these white spaces. We're in the state of Minnesota. We can't get around it. Like, it's around us all the time, whether metaphorically with the snow or actually with the people. Like, we're always surrounded by like whiteness to a certain extent. And we have to still do a good job, still be professionals, still show up for community and ourselves and our families. And that takes a huge emotional toll
Yeah.
out of us, I think, all the time. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about resiliency and strength. How have you navigated conversations around resiliency and strength with some of your BIPOC clients, whether it's in group or other forms,
Mhm.
and how they're utilizing resiliency and strength in their journey of healing.
For me, it goes back to those fundamental things that I was speaking of. Trauma is like, the situation sucks, and I believe I can cope with it. And so sometimes it's just acknowledging, like, hey, we've coped with it. Hey, like, I bring everything back to just this present moment, is taking those things from our past. And yes, they were awful. And my goal is never to, our goal isn't to have this beautiful, easy life. It's just, no matter what happens, moving forward, I'm going to have some beautiful moments and some difficult moments. I'm okay. My feet are on the ground and I'm okay. And reminding people, like, because we are people of color, because we come from possibly generations of having to be resilient, it's this is what we do. This is what we do, is that we have woken up every day. You wake up and your world is there every day. And then that only happens once where you don't. And so we make the best of it. And so what are we doing in this moment today? Because remember, we woke up yesterday. Um, and reminding people too that that's, as far as, there's an edge to it. This is where I feel people of color have a little bit of step up, because I'm an adoptee. I come from a very white family. Um, and the recognition is, hey man, we know what it's like to, no matter what I've done, no matter what my intention is, for some reason things just didn't work out simply because of my appearance, for things that are so far outside of anybody's control because somebody judged me. I have that experience where I've noticed that, especially in my family and in my community, when you're white, the message is, go to school, get good grades, do your homework, be good, graduate, get a partner, get a house, have your 2.5 kids. And if you're really, really good at the game, you'll have a cabin up north with a boat, right? And if I've done anything different from there, then I'm wrong. Not different, I'm wrong. If I want something different, I'm wrong, therefore less than. Man, as a woman, I know that just ain't true. As a person of color, I know that just ain't true. It don't matter how hard I work. Sometimes, yes, I have the stereotype. I'm Asian, so I'm smarter, right? We're just going to dismiss the hard work Jodi did. But I know that's simply not true. And that
Right.
gives me wisdom inside of myself, a
Yep.
whole life experience inside of myself that I get to pivot. I've spent my
Yep.
whole life finding solutions, standing back up, having to get creative. That's resiliency, and not everybody experiences that.
Mm, absolutely. Wow, amazing answer. I had to mute myself. I was laughing when you said have the cabin up north. I remember being a kid and peers, white peers, they're like, oh, what are you doing for the holiday? Or even teachers sometimes. And they're like, they've gone to the cabin, or we went to Wisconsin, or we went up north to the North Shore. And I'm like, I went to my grandma's house. Like, you know what I mean? Like, and I'm like, I don't know. I have no cultural context for a cabin. Now, I didn't call it cultural context. I was like 8 years old, but I'm
Yeah.
like, that was such a foreign thought to me, is to go to a cabin. Like, that
Is
is
this a
like,
log
but it was
cabin?
just, yeah, yeah, like, but it's just a normal thing, and it's not a knock towards white culture or anything, but it's just like it's such a different reality sometimes, and I think that even with that privilege, that sometimes it's overlooked at what that really means, and how your family set up life for you to have that experience, which is an amazing experience, but it is a cultural difference. So thanks for sharing that piece.
Well, yeah, their entire world, when the system's set up for you, this is what you do. And it's, you are told who you are from the day you're born.
Right.
Never ever have to question, which means you truly even know yourself. And that's
Right.
where I love being in spaces with people of color, because
Yep.
we've had to think differently.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. So speaking of spaces with people of color, we often hear about stigma and why people of color don't make it to these healing spaces. What advice do you have for BIPOC individuals who are hesitant to seek out therapy?
It's kind of it's kind of the same as, just find somebody, just find somebody that you can connect with. And if you're a person of color, Let's just unpack like, hey, why does race and the color of your skin have anything to do with that? Let's just talk about that first. But acknowledge it's just real nice sometimes to have somebody separate from your life, so separate from your life that you get to just dump on. And so, what are the things that you feel you need to dump? And do we need to find you a person of color? And then, if you don't like that person, fire them. Fire them. I've gone back and forth between um, Asian therapist myself to lady that was the worst thing I could have done to a white lady back to another Japanese woman, and now I'm starting to think I just need to go find a man to understand. And so it really, again, with sharing my own experiences, is what if you need support and you need therapy and you need help, is your racial identity a piece of that, or are we looking for something that you need to connect on? Maybe it's a different level of trauma. Maybe you need somebody in addiction. Maybe you need somebody that really understands what it is to be LGBTQ. Let's just start there. And if you don't like the person, fire them. Find you a new one. But first, let's just get your foot in the door.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for saying that, and thank you for encouraging people and even, nudging them to give them the permission to let go of their therapist. Because I see a lot of folks who stick with somebody because they don't want to repeat the story or they don't want to find a new location. And I always often joke with people and I say, well, if your barber messed your hair up or your beautician or your nail tech, you wouldn't go back to those people. So you need to do the same thing with your therapist. Like, just
Yeah.
move on.
Yeah. Yeah. When I remind people too, my story maybe 10 years ago, I saw a therapist, it was great. But now that 10 years later, I might interpret that story differently. And now I get to say what I've come. So even though I have to retell my story, I get to change a perspective on it. And that might have a lot to do with why I'm going back.
Wow, thank you. Let's talk a little bit about clinicians. I have like two questions left for you. My first one is, what changes or improvements would you like to see in the mental health field to better support BIPOC providers? So when you think about your experiences, what do you think would either be helpful or things that we should do to improve our field?
Oh man, that's a huge question too.
I'm sorry for
Maybe
dropping the
I'm
big
like,
one.
can we all just get together once a month and have like a big to get together? I feel like um it's hard enough to just be a clinician. It's hard enough to be a clinician, and for me, a parent, what I call solo parent to two teenagers, and take some time for my space for myself. And then you're gonna throw on top of that my CEUs to get my license done, right? Could we have a giant CEU fest for people of color so that I can like get some of this stuff done at the same time and not just have to always go back into the white spaces. And then if I do, you can do them online, but like being able to go into these spaces, and I know myself, I get frustrated. I love in person. I love communicating and talking, but I don't want to go and sit with a bunch of white ladies and explain my right. So being able to do CEUs with people in color about all of the different topics to really explain in a little bit different way and have conversations in that different way that I might not otherwise get to have, I think would be really helpful. And I just think that I wish every clinician across all race, gender, identity was mandated, not supervision, but like, you need to go, we should get therapy twice a month. Mandated, because there's no way that any of us, how can we do our work if we ain't doing it ourselves?
Yeah, I agree with that. That is a great I've never thought about that. I would say I say if we're gonna ask anyone to sit on a quote unquote couch, we need to sit on a couch too. But I like
Yes,
that. Let's mandate 2 free sessions a month for all providers to keep
yes,
your license.
yes, not just my supervision, but my life.
I like that. I like that.
Because we've all
Wow.
had the supervisor, the boss is hitting burnout, or the colleague that's like burnt out and going
Right.
sideways. Like, go to therapy.
Right. Oh my goodness. And the kind of CEU BIPOC fest, that sounds amazing. I think you might have just gave me an idea that I need to push forward.
Let's
Yeah, that's
let's do
awesome.
it.
That's awesome. So my final question for you, and we'll let you go. You've been, this has been amazing. You've given us valuable and just great insight so far. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the audience about your journey as a BIPOC provider or your perspective on how important cultural competence or just cultural responsiveness is in therapy?
Yeah, I think that the more it is so important, and it goes back to like we all need to be doing the work, because the deeper I understand myself, my experiences, it just allows more space for me to understand somebody else's. I do not know anything. I know nothing. The universe has taught me I don't know nothing. But I can know who I am, and just being able to be that open-minded and connect with people by recognizing that we are all so different. And I just because I know about a culture doesn't mean I know about a person, but I can maybe conceptualize how something might have impacted them and how they got to the whole.
Amazing. Jodi, you've been a great guest. Thank you so much for answering my call and being willing to come on the podcast and share. If anybody wants to reach out to you, is there any social medias you would point them to, or an email or website or anything?
Yeah. My social media, I'm not a huge social media presence person. You can always email me at jmholzemer1911 at gmail.com. Yeah.
Perfect.
I like to keep my social media pretty private with my clientele.
Yep, no worries. Understood. Understood. Thank you for sharing at least an email address. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty much it for our time today. I appreciate you coming on, and we'll probably talk to you sometime in the future. We'll definitely get that BIPOC CEU Fest going. So
Yes, I would love to do that. That would be I'll
I
take
might
all
need to have
credit
you
for
on the
that.
planning committee for that one, but we'll make that
I would
happen for
love
sure.
that. I have so many ideas.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks for being on the podcast today, Jodi.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.